How's it going, guys? It's Universal Entertainment here, and I'm going to give you my top 10 classic Doctor Who stories so far. I have seen most of them. You can check out my Doctor Who DVD and Blu-ray collection to see the ones that I own. I have seen some others outside of that. I've probably seen about 12 to 15 outside of that video that I don't own. So I have seen most episodes, but there are some that I haven't seen, and I will update this list when I've seen every episode. I'm not gonna force myself to put an episode on this list that, people put on there most of the time just because it's considered one of the most popular. This is my personal choice. I'm not lying just to be, I guess, correct by Doctor Who fan base standards. This is what I personally think, in my opinion, are my 10 favourite episodes. Okay, and in number 10 on my list is The Three Doctors. This story, it's one that I think is underrated. I think it's a story that people generally like, but they don't rate it as highly as I would. I do highly rate this story. I think it's one of the best John Pertwee stories. I just absolutely adore this episode. I thought Omega is a fantastic villain. He's a villain I would love to see return in the new series. I haven't seen his second appearance. I believe it's I can't remember the name of the episode now. Is it the Arc of Infinity or something? His second episode. I haven't seen that one yet, but I would really like to see that episode. And of course, it has the first time ever that we see more than one Doctor at once. The classic anniversary standards we expect that we get every 10 years is the first time this appears with the first, second, and third Doctors. Patrick Troughton being my favourite Doctor, I was delighted to see Patrick Troughton appear in this story, and maybe it is a little bit of bias because I love Patrick Troughton. He's my favourite Doctor, and maybe it is a little bit of bias because Patrick Troughton's in it. That maybe I like it more because of that. I don't know, but I do think it's a fantastic story, and it's one I like to go back to if I ever feel like a third Doctor story. The Three Doctors is one of the ones I jump to first, so that's why it's number 10 on the list. You might disagree, but I personally think it's the best anniversary special in the classic era. Okay, and in number 9, now this one is one that I'm sure a lot of people will put on their top 10 list. It is the Pyramids of Mars, and this story is just fantastic. I remember seeing this, I believe I was about 9 years old. I saw it on TV, and I think it was on Gold Channel, I think, when they were showing some Fourth Doctor stories. I remember seeing it, and for years, whenever I thought back about my time watching it, it's one of the episodes, if not the episode, though probably the second most standout episode for me. I won't say what the other one is, but it's one of the most standout stories for me when I look back at my time watching those Fourth Doctor stories. I vividly remember certain parts, like the classic part where they go back, when Sarah Jane goes, "Oh, can't you just go forward in time? We know it's all going to be fine and all that." And he goes back and he's like, "Time isn't fixed, it can change." That scene, I remembered that so well. I really remembered it. Even though it had been about 7 years until I got the DVD and I watched it for a second time, that scene in particular really stood out in my mind. I remembered the episode so well. That's one of the things that's one of the things about this story. That's why I love it so much. It's that a story is good when you haven't seen it for 7 years, and you still remember parts of it really well, and it's a story that you like to jump back into. I love this episode. I think it's one of the best of the Fourth Doctor era. It's just a classic. It's one that if you haven't watched, you need to check out. It's just brilliant. So that is why Pyramids of Mars is number 9 on my list. And in 8th place is the recently recovered Enemy of the World. This is such a shock episode because it's one that I wasn't expecting to be all that good. Because of course, it's one that people don't really seem to like it before. Before it was found, it was one that in the audios, they didn't like it too much. And I think Enemy of the World is one of those stories that when it was recovered, people were watching it, people were really surprised by how good it was, just because no one expected it to be as good as it was. I love The Web of Fear as well. It was a contender for the list actually. It only just missed the top 10 because overall I do enjoy The Enemy of that World that little bit more. It's that story that I think is interesting. Like I said, Patrick Troughton's my favourite Doctor. I think that the idea of the Doctor playing, or Patrick Troughton, sorry, playing a villain and the Doctor, I thought that was a genius idea. It's something that maybe couldn't be done ever again. I mean, I think if it was done again, it would be something that people would look and go, that's copying from Enemy of the World a bit too much. But as a one-off, it's just such a great idea, and it's something that, like I said, probably won't ever be done again, and probably shouldn't be done again. It's something that is very different, very risky, but they pulled it off so well. So that is why Enemy of the World is 8th on the list. Next up we have what by many is regarded as the best Pertwee story, and his final episode of his first season, Inferno. This story was... I was really... I wouldn't say I was surprised by this story because I heard how good it was, but when you hear how good a story is, and going into it, it's a classic, very rarely do you just get so blown away by how good it actually is. I've had occasions where there's an episode that people say is amazing. I jump into it, and I'm like, oh yeah, that was good, but I don't think it was the standards that other people put it. Inferno, I will say, I think it is at the standards that people put it. I think it's a fantastic story, a very interesting story that plays with parallel universes, and I thought it just worked really well. I thought it had, I thought the scientist, it's one of those villains that you hate, and it's a good thing you hate him. He's a villain that I hated, because he was an asshole. But it's one of those villains that in the story, I guess you could say he's a villain, because there is no real established villain like the Dalek or the Cybermen, the Master. There is no established villain in that way. There is a sort of threat that in a way becomes a villain, if that makes sense. It's basically like that, this story, and it's really excellent. It's one that if you want to check out a Pertwee story, is one that I would highly recommend you pick up. Just an excellent story, and yeah, I went into it expecting a lot, and I was very, very, very happy with what I saw. It's an episode that I intended to watch a little bit at a time, and once it was on and once it picked up, I just sort of watched the whole thing, and then realised how I probably watched about 5 episodes in one sitting. So yeah, that's how much I loved Inferno, and it's such a great episode. Go and watch it, it's excellent. And in 6th place is Genesis of the Daleks. Now, yes, this is probably a little bit low by some people's standards. Some people will rate this as number 1, number 2, or number 3. Some people might say that it's a requirement to have this story as at least 3rd on the list. But, like I said, I'm not lying. I'm not going to say, oh yeah, it's one of my favourites, or it's my favourite, just because everyone else says it's their favourite. I'm not lying. I'm telling you the truth. I love Genesis of the Daleks. It's an excellent story, but it isn't quite in my top 5. It just misses it. There are some other stories that I like a little bit more. You may be surprised by what some of them are, but Genesis of the Daleks is still a fantastic story, and it's one that, if you want to watch a classic story, you need to hop in and see that one. It's one of the first you should watch. It's just such an excellent story. I just absolutely loved it. It's actually something on first watch I wasn't too keen on. I've watched it first time and I wasn't really blown away by it. But on second watch, I loved it much, much more. And if it wasn't for that second watch, it probably wouldn't be on the top 10 list, if I'll be honest with you. But yeah, like I said, I think I wasn't in the mood to watch Classic Doctor Who the day I watched it first time, because I didn't really find it too interesting. But when I watched it the second time, I loved it. Introduction of Davros, and Davros, this is probably, no, this is the best performance of Davros, I'd say. I'm not saying whether it's the best Davros story, but I think it is the best performance of Davros in the story. And, of course, it's a classic. It's one of the best Dalek stories of all time. And, if you love the Daleks, you've got to watch Genesis of the Daleks. I'm sure you've already seen it. So that's number 6 on the list. Now let's go on to number 5. And starting in the top 5s, we have the swan song of my favourite Doctor, the second Doctor, the War Games. The War Games is a weird episode, because very rarely do you see a long story like this, a 10-parter. Well, there aren't many of them, but this is perhaps the only story that I'd say is over 7 parts, so 8 parts or more. Um, that I think really is excellent. I think the invasion comes very close. I think the invasion is a very good story, and again, it was a contender for the top 10 list. But I don't think it quite makes it. Whereas the War Games is one that, yeah, I think the War Games just is excellent. It's got such a creative story, and it's the first time we ever see the Time Lords. It's just it's the best, in my opinion. It's the best regeneration story. I don't think that there's I can't really see any other stories beating it in terms of the regeneration stories. I think it's just got such, like I said, such a creative plot. The introduction of the Time Lords is excellent. Maybe a little bit too long. Yes, I think it's okay as a 10-parter, but I think if it was 8 parts, it probably would have been a bit better. But the 10 parts work very well. It drags a tiny bit, but that last, 5 parts especially, it picks up so much more. That first 5 parts is very good, but the last 5 parts for me is excellent. When we start to get, a better idea of what's going on, that this isn't exactly what it seems to be, it just picks up so much, and it just solidifies itself as one of my favourite classic Doctor Who stories. Now let's go on to number 4. Yes, in fourth place, it is Remembrance of the Daleks. Okay, I know some people might be shooting me because I'm putting it above Genesis of the Daleks, but no, I really do feel that it is better. I personally enjoy Remembrance of the Daleks more than I do Genesis of the Daleks. I think it's one of the best stories of all time. I do think it's a very good story. I think, yes, Davros isn't very present in the story. I'm not going to judge this as a Davros story, because if I'm going to judge a Davros story by Davros standards, which story did the best job of Davros, then yes, I think Genesis of the Daleks will win. But what do I think is a better story? Personally, what do I enjoy watching more? It is Remembrance of the Daleks. I think that the idea of the Dalek civil war going on between the Renegades and the Imperials, I thought that was excellent. I thought that the Doctor being stuck between two Dalek races, two Dalek factions, sorry, fighting each other, was excellent. I think that the setting, the 1960s setting, they nailed it, because when I watched it first time, I remember it didn't feel like an 80s episode. It felt very 1960s, which they did very well. I think that they nailed the 1960s, as I've said. It doesn't feel like the 1980s. It feels, watching it, like the 1960s, which is what they wanted to do, and what I feel they nailed. They nailed that aspect. Sometimes Doctor Who in the classic era didn't quite, even in the new series, never quite nails the time period it's trying to aim for. Remembrance of the Daleks, in my opinion, is perhaps the best example of them nailing a time period. They nailed the 1960s so well. And, you've got so many iconic figures in that story, like I said, Davros. Yes, he doesn't appear that much, but there's also the I can't remember what the Dalek's called now. The battle Dalek thing. I can't remember what it's called. The name of it escapes my mind. But you see it a lot appear in the new series. I think it appeared in Asylum of the Daleks, and it appeared in Witch's Familiar and The Magician's Apprentice. You'll no doubt know which Dalek I mean. It's a very iconic looking Dalek, even though it only really appeared properly once. It's such a great idea, and I just love the story. I think it's the best Davros story. Best story to feature Davros, I should say. And I just think it's excellent. I'm sorry if you're offended that I've put it above Genesis of the Daleks, but for me, I do prefer it more than Genesis. Okay, and in third place, this one will probably shock some people, but at the same time, I think others won't be surprised. I think a lot of people will be surprised that I put it so high, but I do personally think it deserves the spot, and that's the Moonbase. I really do think that this episode deserves third spot. Yes, 2 episodes I'm missing. Yes, the animation, they are, animated in the DVD release. I'm sure that there are some people watching this who haven't bought the Moonbase and haven't watched it because it is animated, but the animation in the story is very good. That's a different topic. That's, judging the animation on the DVD release. But as an episode, I think it's fantastic. I really do think it's one of the best Cybermen stories of all time. I think that they've really nailed the Cybermen in the story. This was the second appearance of the Cybermen, and I think it's the first real appearance of the Cybermen that they nailed, because I think the 10th planet, they had to, so they kind of created a rough concept for the Cybermen, in many ways. And then you've got to have that second story that just sort of solidifies that alien, that crew, that monster as a amazing villain. I think the Moonbase does that successfully. If it wasn't for this story being so good, I don't think we'd be seeing the Cybermen ever again. I think that they would have had a 10th planet appearance, and that was about, and the Moonbase, of course. But I don't think we would have seen anything else after that, because they nailed the Cybermen in the story. They had a great idea with the whole disease in the base that had a mystery around it, and I thought that was an excellent concept. And it's sort of that idea actually makes me think of makes me think of Waters of Mars in many ways. I know it's slightly different, but I think that I mean, if you've seen both episodes, you know what I mean. I don't want to give too much away, because I don't want to ruin the story for those who haven't watched it. But I think it's a really good story that just go and watch it. I don't want to talk too much about the story, but go and watch it. It's excellent. Yes, if you want to buy the DVDs, 2 episodes are animated, but believe me, that doesn't matter. Go and watch it. I think it's the 3rd best Doctor Who classic story that I've seen so far. Okay, now on to the top 2. In second place is The Ark in Space, the second story that Tom Baker did, and it's actually the first story that I ever saw. So, okay, yeah, there may be some bias in there, but as many people do judge it as one of the best, if not the best, Doctor Who classic story, I kind of think that for the most part, my opinion on this is valid. I just think this is a really great story. I think there's a fantastic villain in the Wirren, and they're kind of a villain that, you know, are probably one of my top picks from the classic series of villains that I would love to see in the new series. You know, I'm sure that they can do some new stuff with them. They're not really a kind of villain that you have unlimited possibilities with, you know, but I think they could manage to get some sort of story out of the Wirren, if they were to bring them back to the new series. But, you know, we'll see. But yeah, I just think this is a really great story, and it's one that a lot of people will recommend, and I can't help but agree. I highly recommend you check it out. It's one of the best, and in my opinion, it does surpass, you know, like I said earlier on this list, Genesis of the Daleks was there. In my opinion, people will say Genesis of the Daleks is the best episode of Tom Baker's first season. I personally think The Ark in Space is better. So, one that I highly recommend you check out. Go and buy it. If you haven't yet watched it, I'd say, and you haven't watched what's going to be first place, so we'll get onto that in a second, this is the one that I recommend you go and watch first. I'm sure you'll love it. I have never met anyone who said that they don't like it, so check it out. Good story. So, now on to number 1. And number 1, a lot of people say this one, and it's one of those ones that, yes, people love it, and I'm not just saying it to go along with the crowd. I think I've tried to prove in my other videos that I'm not the kind of person who will just go on with the crowd, in my underrated videos especially. In my opinion, The Tomb of the Cybermen is the best Doctor Who story of the classic era, and one of the best of all time. Probably easily my top 3 of all time. I think it's just an absolutely superb story. I mean, I don't think I've watched any classic story as much as I've watched Tomb of the Cybermen. This isn't a one-time watch, and I loved it and haven't watched it since. I probably watched this episode 6, 7, 8 times. I just absolutely adore this episode. I think it's got such a good plot, and I believe I said it in the Moonbase that they haven't done Cybermen as good in the new series, or even in the 70s and 80s. They haven't done them like they did in the Patrick Troughton era, and to a degree, the Hartnell era at the very end. They haven't managed it. The Cybermen in Tomb of the Cybermen are just great. There's not exactly many, like, you know, now you just have hundreds of Cybermen that, you know, are attacking, and that's the big problem in every single Cyberman story in the new series. In this one, there's a few Cybermen, but for the most part, there's one Cyberman that's causing a problem, and they're in a very confined area. Why can't we have that kind of Cyberman story? That's the best kind. You don't need hundreds of Cybermen, and they yet still seem to fail at conquering the world. All you need is that one Cyberman, that can cause loads of problems in a confined area and be very difficult to deal with. They've just really weakened the Cybermen in the new series, and also to a degree in the later parts of the classic era. They've really done a bad job with the Cybermen, and I think that of all the villains that they've really poorly executed in the new series, I think Cybermen is probably the top. There isn't a single Cyberman story in the new series that I consider to be good, unlike Tomb of the Cybermen, which in my opinion is just the best Cyberman story and one of the best of all time. I mean, I know I'm probably angering people who are massive Cybermen fans in the new series. I really do think that Russell T Davies botched them, and the catchphrase was stupid. I think that Moffat has somewhat eased the poorness of the execution. I think he's made it a little bit better by getting rid of the delete catchphrase, but I still think he's botched them. I still think that his new Cybermen are almost as equally as botched as Russell T Davies were. I don't think either of them really know why the Cybermen are good, because this is what the Cybermen are good. This is what good Cybermen are like. This is a good Cyberman story, not all the other ones we had in the new series, in my opinion at least. So that is my top 10 classic Doctor Who stories. Hope you enjoyed this video. List yours down below in the description. I'm definitely going to read them and see what you think. But other than that, thank you for watching. Comment, subscribe on this video, and I will see you in the next video.